Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paul Azell. I'm Principal at Royal Holloway, University of London. A very warm welcome to the 2018 Fawcett Lecture. We're gathered tonight here in Senate House. This splendid Art Deco building was constructed, as many of you will know, during the 1930s. And even in this age of glass and steel towers rising across London, it remains one of the most prominent buildings on the skyline. Senate House is the administrative centre of the University of London and houses the fabulous Senate House Library, mainly upstairs and in the tower. Much like our own Founders Building on Royal Holloway's campus in Egham, Senate House is of great architectural significance and a listed building. When constructed, the university's Vice-Chancellor, Sir William Beveridge, described the building as an academic island in swirling tides of traffic, a world of learning in a world of affairs. Now tonight, our guest speaker, Jayne-Anne Gadhia, Chief Executive of Virgin Money, will talk about both learning and affairs in the wider world. Now this lecture series is named after Dame Millicent Fawcett, an English suffragist, political and union leader and writer. It was endowed in 1929 by Teresa Goss, an alumna of Bedford College, one of Royal Holloway's founding institutions. According to the terms of the endowment, the subject matter should deal with the change in the position of women. And it's fitting that we should be holding this biannual lecture in the centenary of the centenary year of the first women in the UK to be given the vote. The university we are today is built on foundations of two of the very first institutions established to give women access to higher education, Bedford College and Royal Holloway College. Our founders were at the vanguard of progressing women's equality, and this year we're playing a significant national role in celebrating women's suffrage and our own progressive history and commitment to diversity and equality. Our guest this evening, who joins a distinguished list of previous speakers, is an alumna of Royal Holloway. Jayne-Anne Gadhia studied history before training as a chartered accountant and entering the world of financial services with Norwich Union. But it's her role with Virgin Money which has seen her move into the public spotlight. Working in a sector which she herself describes as having an old boys culture, she set out to make the sorts of changes I believe Millicent Fawcett would have been proud to be associated with. Jayne-Anne has described herself as a troublemaker, although she's probably more correctly described as a trailblazer for change. In 2015, she was invited by the government to lead a review into gender equality and diversity in the financial services sector, particularly the issue of getting more women into senior leadership positions. This work led to Her Majesty's Treasury launching a Women in Finance Charter, a commitment by firms to work together for gender equality and greater diversity in the industry. The following year, she was appointed as the government's Women in Finance champion. In her book, The Virgin Banker, she not only talks about her career, but also about periods of depression in a frank and open manner, shining the spotlight on a subject which is still something of a taboo in some areas of business. Jayne-Anne has broken the mould by refusing to do anything other than be herself. In doing so, she's a role model for everyone, excited by making business better by being true to themselves and making a positive change in society. These themes resonate with the motto of Royal Holloway, taken from the coats of arms of our founding college, Bedford College, Esse quam videre, which means to be rather than to seem. This evening, in conversation with Professor Katie Normanton, Royal Holloway's Senior Vice Principal, Jayne-Anne tells us more about her career, the challenges she has faced, and how, among other things, she is making the financial services and the world of work more inclusive for all women from all backgrounds. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jayne-Anne Gadhia and Katie Normanton.
Thanks very much. We'll just take a moment to check that everyone can hear us, perhaps. Hello. That was really nice, Paul. Thank you. I never recognise myself at things like that, but thank you.
Okay, great. It's very interesting because 2 years ago we had Jenny Murray here in conversation as well. One of the themes that came through very strongly from her was actually the sense of how much her parents, particularly her mother, and her upbringing had really driven her to be the person that she was. Now, you talk in your book quite a bit about your background, upbringing. Has it made the person that you are today? Oh, gosh, definitely.
I mean, it is quite interesting. I came from a proper working class family, from the Midlands actually, although I grew up in Norfolk before I came to Royal Holloway. And I was thinking as we were talking at work today or yesterday about skiing, right? And everybody now talks about taking their kids skiing, as far as I can see, certainly those that work in the city. I never knew you could go skiing when I was growing up. Do you know what I mean? It was something that other people did. And my mum and dad were always very surprised at everything that was in the bigger world, if you like. And they both died in 2016, which is really why I wrote my book. And when I think about how I miss them, the really interesting thing is that my mum was definitely about, she was very religious actually, but she was very much about love and doing the right thing and making sure that the world was a better place. And my dad was very much about driving for results and getting business done and asking me how I'd got on today at work. And I think, I've been very fortunate to have inherited, if you like, I hope, a little bit of both of those things. And I can see that in some of the things that really drive me forward. So I think for all of us, I think about it with my daughter, we genuinely are, aren't we, role models for our kids, whether they're our own kids or everybody else's. And it's taken me to get quite old to realise that, I think.
So you ended up going to Royal Holloway to study history. How did you hear about Royal Holloway?
Oh, God. The other thing that I realised, and it's quite interesting to see Peter Gower-Griffiths down here today, because you remind, I didn't recognise you, Peter, actually, because we've aged just a little tiny bit since we were at university together, but and haven't seen each other for 40 years. It is 40 years when you're asking me why did I go to Royal Holloway. I think I was, the only thing I've ever chosen because I loved it was history. And I was very, very keen after I'd been enjoying history at school to go somewhere that was well known for history. And there was a wonderful professor there at the time who I mentioned to you, Katie, earlier, called Roger Lockyer. And some of you remember him, yeah? And, he'd written lots of books. He was quite famous, and I particularly enjoyed that. And so it was the history that took me there, but it took me to different places.
And we were just talking as well, I mean, you mentioned in your book your memory of Royal Holloway is, and you describe a hall made of breeze blocks with the wind.
Yeah, I'm shocked that that's gone.
I said, that must be unblown, and you said, yes, I was right.
Definitely,
but,
yeah.
So what do you, what was influential in your time at Royal Holloway?
Oh, I mean, everything was different. Everything was different from my own experience, whether that's just the living away from home thing, or in particular the fact that it was the first time that I'd met the Indian community. I married an Indian man who was who I met on my first day at Royal Holloway. We are still together, although we did have a row this morning about the boiler, so it doesn't change. Things don't change in 40 years, I've discovered. And I think it was discovering a new and different way of life. I mean, I genuinely remember, and funnily enough, it's obviously something that comes back to me a lot because I mention it in my book, and my book is Just a Stream of Consciousness, that until I met Ash, and I was definitely, in Athlone when this happened, I'd never, ever peeled a clove of garlic. I mean, how ridiculous does that sound these days, This was 40 years ago, don't forget. And I remember us going to Paris together at some point, not that, while we were there, and eating a mango for the first time. And now you think, how on earth could that be in my lifetime that that could seem so fresh and new and exciting? And I think, like I'm sure for all of our kids as you go to university, you find things that you never experienced in your home and normal life. And for me, when this lecture really has prompted me to think back on those things, and I think about them in smell and colour and sight and experience because they were beyond what was normal for me at the time.
And what about doing a history degree? I mean, has that given you things that you've taken through your life? Because you've gone on to do something very different.
Yeah, I mean, everything else, I have to admit, after having chosen to do a history degree was accident, really. And I think that the reason that I've always thought that history has been so powerful, and it's interesting, I meet quite a lot of people that have got history degrees, but also kids that say, is it okay for me to do a history degree because I love it, but will it get me a job, if you see what I mean? And what I broadly say is, as far as I can see, despite the troubles of our times and the change of social media, human nature remains fundamentally the same. And I think that you can see that through history, and I find that, you know, informative, compelling, instructive and inspiring. And the story of where we've come from, I think, is really important in terms of who we are and where we're going. So for me, I love it, and I always will do.
Does that sort of previous breadth, is that something you look for in graduates that you may be employing? I know, talking to some employers, they say very deliberately they leave a certain percentage of places in their companies for graduates coming from different fields because they feel that the diversity actually makes for a better company and higher performance. But is that something Virgin Money actively looks for?
I suppose the difference in asking what I look for and what Virgin Money looks for, if I'm really honest. So as we set up Virgin in financial services as a very small and entrepreneurial company, we have definitely always recruited for attitude rather than for skills, if that's the right thing. You know, broadly, if you can walk, add up and read and you're a brilliant person, then you'll be a brilliant business person and a brilliant banker, in my view. I don't think, I'm sorry for those of you that are purists about this, I don't think you have to be a business student, a maths graduate or an anything else to be successful in life. I think you just have to, but personally think you have to know who you are and be prepared to stand up for your values, be bright enough and disciplined enough to, you know, to continue to develop. But often it's taking the risk into the unknown, I think, that takes you out of your comfort zone. And you know, you see that thing on social media, there's a sort of circle and a big dot just outside the circle in the top right-hand corner, which with a cross, and it says, you know, your comfort zone is the circle and the cross is outside your comfort zone. And the strap line is where the magic happens, and I think that people that are prepared to go outside their comfort zone are the ones that make magic happen personally. Now, I am not doing the thing that I hated, and I hope we're not going to get onto politics, but, you know, the get rid of experts thing, I don't agree with that. I think experts are really important, but I do think that you can excel and succeed by being yourself, by having the right attitude and by wanting to change the world, and you don't have to be steeped in a particular discipline to do that.
So you leave Royal Holloway with your history degree and then you make a decision... Oh, sorry, let me try moving this up a bit.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Is that any better? No, it is switched on.
Hold it up to your mouth.
Try going even now. Is that any better? I have to shout, I think. Okay. It's just why I did drama. You leave Royal Holloway with with a history degree, and you decide to train as an accountant. That seems like quite a large jump, but was this something you'd done previously? You'd done maths at school and enjoyed it, or where did this idea come from?
Well, I mean, I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. Well, it wasn't even important to me what I wanted to do when I left university, actually, because I just wanted to be with my husband. Well, he wasn't my husband then, but Ash. And, you know, he was the eldest son of an Indian immigrant family who were determined that he'd have an arranged marriage. And so he left his home, went to live with my mum and dad, although his family didn't know that. And I just needed a job near to where he was, which happened to be in Norfolk, where my family lived. And so my challenge actually was, how do I get a job in Norfolk rather than what do I want to do with my career? And I got onto the university milk round, found that actually getting into accountancy was relatively straightforward. I was paid £4,250 a year. I absolutely remember that. And it felt like, you know, excellent, that's done. I've sort of, you know, done the hygiene thing. Now I wonder what this accountancy thing's all about. And I wasn't very good at it.
And you go from being accountant into Norwich Union, but you're heading your way into a financial world, insurance world, a world where perhaps women aren't particularly well represented even now, but I presume then even less so.
I mean, I never was aware of that particularly. So in all of the years that I've spent at work, I've never actually felt any particular discrimination because I've been a woman. I've never particularly noticed how many women and men have been around me at any one point in time because actually, you know, my friends and networks have been pretty well balanced, I think, and I hadn't really thought about it in terms of hierarchy. And you're sort of going through this in a chronological way, so I know we'll get there in the end, but I'd never wanted to be a sort of feminist, if that's the right way forward. The thing that shocked me into getting involved with the Women in Finance Charter was finding that financial services is worse in terms of women's progress than any other industrial sector that there is, and I couldn't understand why the sector that I was in, that I hadn't noticed was a particular problem, actually was, and that's why I wanted to get involved. So, no, I don't think I've particularly felt, even in the early days, in any way discriminated against. I probably was always a little bit mouthy.
But were you aware that you were often the only woman in the room? Or
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But I was aware of it, but not, I didn't feel odd or intimidating particularly. It just was how it was, if you know what I mean.
There's quite a lot of early stories that you tell in your book about just the sheer difficulty of setting up schemes or having to take over running the sales team or things like that, where you just seem to be thrown into a situation. Did you learn things from that, and is that how you thrived?
Oh, definitely. I mean, so for me, the biggest learning thing there's several actually, several learning things. So the first one that you've just made me think about was that, so I, trying to be an accountant, sort of managed it. I didn't enjoy it. And I qualified with what's now EY, they were called Ernst & Winnie then. And Norwich Union, now Aviva, was their big client in Norfolk. And it was really unheard of for anybody that was in the professional firm to join the client. And so I was the first person that went over the wall, as it were, in that sense. And I joined a business that was called the Unit Trust business, a sort of asset management business, and it was relatively dull. There wasn't very much going on, and we were just about to launch some new investment funds, which would have been quite exciting. I was the accountant of it when the 1987 crash happened. Would it have been Black Monday? For those that remember it. And of course, the whole thing slowed down again, and I was getting really fed up. And I remember going to see my boss and saying, I'm really bored at work, what are you going to do about it? And of course he made it very clear that actually I needed really to do something about it. And I remember leaving for Christmas that year to go on holidays, Christmas holidays, and him saying to me, Jane, I don't want you to come back here after Christmas. I want you to, and I thought I was being fired actually, but for complaining so much. And he said, I want you to go into the marketing team. And I said, I don't know anything about marketing, Barry. And he said, well, you keep on complaining that we're not selling enough products, and go and sort it out. And I thought, gosh, how on earth do I do that? And turned up in marketing when we came back after Christmas. And there was a man there, he was the sales director at the time, called David Everett. And I went to see him. He was he seemed old to me then. He's probably younger than I am now, how embarrassing. And he said to me, I said, David, I've no idea how to make this business thrive. And he said, Jayne-Anne, what you have to do, because Norwich Union sold through agents on the outside, in the field, as it were, you have to go and see all of these people and make them want to do it for you. And I thought, I don't know really what you mean by that, but I remember the next 12 months being on the road in a little white car and going to see lots and lots of people and just saying to them, if ever you think about this particular sort of business, put it with Norwich Union, because that'll be really helpful for me, ringing them up from time to time. And, completely astonishingly, at the end of that year, sales had gone up 800%. And I realised then, it's a bit like my point around, it's great to be an expert, but sometimes it's about attitude, that in the end, people do things for people. It's all about people. And I think that's been the great unlocker, really.
Is that how... Oh, I'm
back on.
Is that how you drove a high-performing team? Because that's very much what comes out of that story, is that you have to align all the sales team to actually have them working in a way that's going to work. I mean, it goes up 800%, but that's not just you going out, it's a whole team as well going out to talk to financial advisors, insurance brokers, etc., I assume. How do you do that? I
mean, I think I'm a great believer that a common purpose is better. Common goal is important, a common purpose is stronger, if you see what I mean, in terms of emotional alignment. And I think that, purpose is really important to get everybody aligned. And you see that in football teams, don't you? If you're not all aligned with, you don't like football. Sorry, I'm Man United. We were talking Manchester United earlier. But, you've got to get a team aligned behind a purpose, not just the result, I think, or you can't thrive.
Yeah. Thanks. You then obviously end up in a part where you're working for the Royal Bank of Scotland and with Fred Goodwin.
it's an organisation which is going to end out in crisis, obviously. You leave it, I think, just before that crisis happens. But it's interesting reading about your writing on that. You see that there are some...
It's not me.
I think I'm doomed. You see that there are, quite early on, there are some issues that are going on in terms of how they're being run, in terms of what they're being built upon. So, I mean, you reflect and say that you can see this coming. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's a hindsight comment, not a foresight comment, right? So, so to your point, RBS bought the Virgin business that I was running at the time. I and all of my team went to RBS. And I thoroughly enjoyed it, right? For 5 of the 6 years that I was there, I learned a lot of good stuff, met a lot of good people, and managed to have a bit less of a crazy life than you do working for Virgin, maybe. And it was only in the 6th year when things started to really crack. And there were 3 particular things that had gone on that I didn't like and the guys I was working with didn't like. One was, and this is now 11 years ago, so of course it's not quite so obvious now what was going wrong, but in 2007, the mortgage market, I was running the mortgage business for RBS, and the mortgage market was getting difficult. And I was called in, not by Fred, but by somebody very senior at RBS, and said to be told, you know, there's another business called Northern Rock that is succeeding far better than you are at mortgages, and why aren't you doing it as well as Northern Rock? And as a team, we couldn't see how on earth Northern Rock was succeeding in what it did, so we were scratching our heads around how to deal with that. The second thing was that, and again, you know, it's a sort of old-fashioned comment now, but it became very important during the crisis. I remember the guy that ran the corporate bank called me in and said, Jayne-Anne, everybody else is securitising mortgages, securitising subprime mortgages, and we're not doing that. Why aren't we doing it? And my friend and colleague Dave Dyer and I hadn't heard of securitising subprime mortgages, I'm afraid. So we were working in Edinburgh, came down to the big city to go and see the very clever people that could tell us why this was a sensible thing to do. And I remember both of us going home going, no idea how that works. And then the third thing was that somebody that was in my team, somebody wrote in to Fred an anonymous note about him and said, this guy's obviously got his hand in the till because he's living a lifestyle beyond his means. And unfortunately, the culture at RBS at the time meant that the assumption was that he was guilty before proven innocent. Of course, it turned out that his father had died and left him a lot of money. And those 3 things together that all happened in a short period of time made me unhappy. And the guys that I was working with, remember Dave and Paul, who work with us still today. Dave was my finance director at the time, Paul my marketing director. And they came into my room one Thursday in RBS Gogarburn in Edinburgh and said, when we sold our business to Richard Branson all those years ago, he said if we didn't like corporate life, we could come back, give him a call and let's go back. And I thought, all right. I mean, that was one of those moments, because if you think about those sort of things rationally, you wouldn't do it. And I hadn't spoken to Richard for 3 or 4 years, probably, certainly 2 or 3 years. And I picked up the phone and rang and said, do you remember that promise you made me? And he said, yes. And he said, go down and see a guy called Gordon McCallum in London on Tuesday. This was the Thursday. Go down on Tuesday, and by the following Thursday, we'd agreed to go back, come back to Virgin, as it were. And over the next few months, I know 82 people came back with me, and we were really worried about being sued by RBS, but it felt like we'd escaped from prison. So it was a good time.
So I think one of the things you've identified is that the values of a company are really important to you. I mean, that's one of the things that's making you unhappy at RBS. Do you think that's something that's particularly gendered? I mean, is it that women particularly like a culture where the values match up to their expectations?
No, I think
it's just people.
It's just people. Absolutely no. I mean, I'm definitely not, as I say. I know that such a word doesn't. I don't believe such a word exists. But you tell me, you're the professor, sort of thing. Does it work? Because I'm not a feminist. I feel I'm an equalitist. Right? It's not about women instead of men. It's about women and men being treated equally in everything that we do. Excellent. If that's what a feminist is, that's exactly what I am. But it's very important for me to say that, because running a company of 3,000 people, the last thing that you want is to put men offside, if you see what I mean, by implying that all we're really interested in is making sure that women thrive. So it's about making sure that everybody thrives. And, in my experience, men, one of the reasons that I think this approach to life has worked for me has been that actually it's very much a Richard Branson approach to life. You know, the Virgin brand, whatever you think about Richard, I've worked for him, you know, for most of 25 years now. I've never seen anything other than a principled, values-driven approach. There have been some mistakes along the way. We all make them. He's very high profile. He makes them in front of cameras, right? But actually, it's very much a values and purposeful-driven organisation, and he's always supported me and others in that sort of approach.
You mentioned Richard, and I think I've missed out a rather delightful moment that you first meet him. I think you're at that point reading Hello magazine or something, and he's on the cover of it, and you say to a friend, oh, I'd really like to meet him, and your friend happens to know someone who's just started to work at Virgin, and you then kind of piece it all together. Do you see that as something you engineered? Was it luck? Did things come your way, or, you know, how do you see life sort of going for you? Do you happen to be in the right place, or are you making it all happen?
Oh, I think, I mean, and I do feel quite clear about that now. Have I gone off now? Am I still on? Okay. I mean, I feel quite clear about that now, which is, I think that I see a lot of people, a lot of my friends, agonising over whether or not to take opportunities that are in front of them. And broadly, I've always been stupid enough just to take them and not think too hard about it, because I think you can always talk yourself out of things. You know, this particular job that I took in the marketing department when I was an accountant had actually been offered to a friend of mine who was an actuary at the time. And I remember her saying to me, you know, you're ridiculous taking that job. I think it's beneath us. We're qualified people. I'm a qualified actuary. And I didn't define myself as an accountant. I just was interested in the job, if you see what I mean. And I'm still in touch with her. Sally Hannington is her name. And she always says that made the difference between what she did, which she did very well as an actuary, and what I did, which was a bit more random sort of thing. And I've always tried to take my chances. And it drives everybody at Virgin Money mad, because we do crazy things that perhaps we wouldn't otherwise do. But I think we have a bit of fun along the way.
I mean, you talk quite a lot about the kitchen table test as you're setting up various different things, particularly for Virgin Money, as it, I suppose, eventually became, which was really a sort of test that it should make sense for the person who's looking at the products from home, and they should be able to understand exactly what it is there, that it's not being sold through financial advisors, etc. It's a kind of sort of pragmatic, common sense approach to things. Do you think that sort of defines your approach?
I think, well, I mean, we define, or I thought came up with the kitchen table test because, and I don't know if this resonates with everyone, you know, certainly in my job, I can be blinded by the technicalities of product stuff and regulation and what everybody else tells you is going to work and how you think you should write literature for customers. And it all sort of makes sense in the bubble of compliance with your organisation's rules and regulations, and then it all comes out, it arrives on your, you know, then in the post, and you open it on a Saturday morning at the kitchen table and go, I have no idea what this is talking about. And so we've always tried to get to a place where the thing that ends up with the customer is something that we understand when your mindset is normal human rather than banker, if you see what I mean. And it's much more challenging than that sounds. Trying to do, and you know, I can see that. I remember we were not that long ago at Virgin Money trying to do our first digital thing, and you know, the risk team were very focused on making sure it was compliant, which meant that on a mobile phone you had sort of reams of banking stuff. Never going to work. Nobody was going to use it on their mobile phone, but it was compliant, and you have to work out, I think, how do you get that balance right?
Yeah. So this sort of notion that you're breaking the mould as you do things, I mean, again, how do you think you're achieving that, and what's driving you to do that? I mean, quite often you use the word fight in your book as well. Yeah.
You're
maybe
very,
more
very
than
well researched.
maybe more than you think you do, but it did sort of stand out quite a bit. And particularly you talk about perhaps learning some of that from your school experience as well, because I think you're sent to a sort of boys' school that's just beginning to take girls when you're about 13 or something. So.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I think in a good sense it has all felt a bit of a battle. I don't know why that is. I think it's because, I don't know if you all agree with this, along the way in our lives, for good or for bad, there are very often people that are trying to tell us that we can't do things. You know, and whether or not that's been, you know, in my work life, predominantly I guess it has been men, but that's mainly because I've been working predominantly with men. Women can definitely do it as well. And I've always felt that you have to find a way around that, whether that's a Fred Goodwin or a Richard Branson or, I don't know, anybody else, and try to find... I've always thought about life and work as a bit of a crossword puzzle. I used to like doing the cryptic crossword on the back of the Telegraph and finding that in the end you could always find the way through it. And I've always thought of a work problem like that. You know, there's always a solution if only you've got the clues. You just have to get your head in the space to get to the right outcome, if you see what I mean. And that's been quite important. But yeah, I mean, I quite like the thought of finding a way through an obstacle, definitely.
As Paul mentioned in his introduction, you're the government's Women in Finance champion. Is it, now we may be getting onto equality and feminism issues here, but is it slightly depressing that the government needs one of those in this day and age?
I think it's quite positive that they've thrown so much support behind it. I mean, it is really interesting. So, I mean, if ever I'm now in an environment like this, I'm afraid I tell this story and I enjoy it every time. So if you'll bear with me, can I just tell this story? Am I allowed to say a rude word?
I'm sure.
Right, excellent. Okay. So in banking, the sort of big do of the year is Chancellor's Mansion House speech. And I remember being invited the very first time. And when you go into this quite intimidating Mansion House atmosphere, I mean, it is genuinely a room that's full of white middle-aged men in dinner suits. Very, very few women, still very few women. And it is quite intimidating. The very first time I went, I remember, you get given this really complicated seating plan. And, you know, there's about 400 people there. So you find your name on the back of the plan. It gives you a table setting, and you pull the plan out, and you work out where you're sat at the table. And you sort of, as it seems to me, work your way through. So in the first year, I was literally by the loos at the back, at the bottom. And then the next year, I was a bit closer to the middle, etc., etc. Anyway, this particular year, which would have been June 2015, I arrive at the Mansion House feeling somewhat intimidated. And Antonio Hotrasario, who runs Lloyd's, was in the corner. I went over to talk to him because I've known him for a while. And a very posh banker, who I'd always felt talked down to me, came over. And that was absolutely certain because I was talking to Antonio, not actually to come and talk to me. Which does go to show, doesn't it, how women, or certainly I feel sometimes, but who knows if that's right, but that's how it felt. Anyway, Antonio turned away to talk to somebody else, and this banker said to me, "So where are you sitting tonight?" And I said, "I don't know, because I haven't got my glasses and I can't read my name on the table plan, right?" So he said, "Well, let me have a look." So he goes, Guardian, opens it up, and he went, "Fuck, you're sat next to the Chancellor." And it absolutely was a lovely moment, and every time I tell that story, I enjoy it again. So thank you for letting me do that. And so I sat next to George Osborne that night. And actually, the other funny bit about it, because I liked George, and I've stayed in touch with him a bit, I liked George Osborne, and I know that's not necessarily politically acceptable. Very different in person than he came over, I think, in the media. And we talked a lot over dinner about all sorts of stuff, and he gave a speech, funny enough, about RBS and, you know, repaying RBS shares being sold to repay the government. And as he stood up to give his speech, he just looked at me and said, "You do realise, don't you, the TV cameras will be on you, so try and look interesting." So I thought, I'd better try and look interested. And so, embarrassingly, there's this picture of me, which I hope you haven't seen, where I'm looking adoringly at George, which didn't go down terribly well when I got back to the office. Anyway, sorry. So there's a more serious point than that, isn't there? So anyway, so obviously it was a bit of an interview, because the next day his office got in touch and said, "The Chancellor's asked us to ask you whether or not you'd lead this programme on women in finance." And I said, "Why on earth would I do that?" And they said, "Because financial services is the worst performing sector when it comes to progressing women." And as I say, when I first saw that, I thought, well, how on earth can that be right? Because, you know, it's very easy to simplify why there may be more men than women generally in organisations or industry generally around, well, women are mothers, if you see what I mean. Women are mothers in financial services as much as they are in other industries, Jayne-Anne, so how can that be? And of course, when we started to research the point and asked women why they didn't progress in financial services, nobody mentioned motherhood. And it was really, really interesting. Everybody said it's about culture. And culture is very important to me. So I thought, well, you know what, we should try and do something to change the culture then.
So that obviously comes out in your the Gadhia review, the Empowering Productivity, Harnessing the Talents of Women in Financial Services. You talk obviously very much about culture in there and about the need to change it. It's 2 years since that report came out. Do you think cultures have been moving on in that time?
I mean, it's interesting. So what we did this particular report, and what came out of it, as Paul had said earlier, was that we felt that organisations, financial services organisations, should sign up to a Women in Finance Charter, which would mean that they... I was in two minds about quotas. And so the sort of route that we took was to say, well, let's not set a quota at the governmental level. Let's say to organisations, treat this like a business problem, set your own targets, explain why they're sensible, and then just go and deliver them. And P.S., be bonused on them, which was very interestingly a challenge. And so it's been quite interesting that as companies have signed up to this charter, fascinatingly, the vast majority have set their own targets and said, we will get to 50-50. Now, when they get there, when organisations commit themselves to get there, is slightly different. But broadly, organisations have said we'll be at 50-50 by 2020. If organisations do that and do that off their own merit, as it were, off their own back, then that will be a huge result, which I'll be really chuffed with. And so I think that's changing the culture. Yeah. I mean, the cultural point in many ways comes from unconscious bias in all sorts of areas. And, you know, Paul, you generously referred to me as someone that's interested. I'm sorry I don't look that way, it's because my mic's on this side. That's somebody that is championing diversity through the gender agenda. That's just how it manifests itself through the Women in Finance Charter. You know, for me, diversity in all its aspects is critical. And I think that you get better business results the more diverse your management team is and your businesses.
I think research has showed that, hasn't it?
For sure.
People who, companies that have diverse boards tend to perform more highly than those
significantly
that don't.
so, yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Just sort of moving on as well to some of the other things that you've promoted. I think perhaps surprisingly within your book you talk quite openly about mental health issues. I mean, you recount in there how your mother, I think, suffered from depression and was sort of on tranquilizers for a lot of her life. And then indeed after the birth of your daughter that you suffer from postnatal depression. That notion of talking about mental health, of showing that you're vulnerable, is not something that has happened too much from leaders, I guess. I mean, did you feel you're putting your neck on the line about those sorts of things, or was it something that was very important for you to talk about?
So I don't think I've ever shared this publicly before. So I did feel I was putting my neck on the line, and I'd written that chapter, but I hadn't rounded that chapter, if you see what I mean. And quite a senior journalist took me out for dinner one night. He'd been in America for a few years with a particular paper and had come back to the UK, and he wanted to catch up. And we had a bottle of wine, and I said to him that I was writing a book and that I was worried about whether or not I should put in a chapter on mental health. And he was particularly moved by it because his best friend had literally just committed suicide. And so we had a long conversation around all of the issues that you'd expect. And both ended up in tears, actually, come to think of it, over that bottle of wine. And he said, right, let me read the chapter. And so while we were there in the restaurant, he read the chapter and he went, it's just not good enough. If you're going to do it, you can't half-do it. You've got to do it properly. So I said to him, well, if I do it properly, won't I get slaughtered in the press and in the city? And he said, if you do it properly, we will cover it, so you'll know it's the Sunday Times. And I will make sure that if you get criticism, then I will push back on that. And that's what gave me the strength to do it. I was worried about it. I was unaware of any negative comment. My team might have, crossed it out if stuff had come in that they didn't think I should say. I'm not aware of that at all. But I think it's one of those examples of, networks are important and supporting each other is important. And I wouldn't have done it without him. I mean, it was still a big deal, but I wouldn't have done it without him saying, I'm going to support you through it, if you see what I mean. And, so often the press, rightly in my opinion, get criticised for the things that they do report on. But in times like that, it's very important that they're supportive of some of the agenda that they do put forward.
I think in your book as well, you say, it's my time to use a rude word now, that you once didn't get promoted, and your boss said to you you weren't promoted because you didn't have a thick skin or the ability to bullshit. Now, that was quite early in your career. I mean, have you developed those things? Have you had to develop them?
Yes. Lots.
You felt the need to develop them, or did you find your own way, I suppose, is also my question to you.
I mean, I think my skin... Well, I don't know if my skin's got thicker, but I'm much less sensitive to everything critical, if you see what I mean. So I'm much more comfortable in myself, if that's what you mean. And I remember meeting a brilliant man once, an Indian guy, completely irrelevant that he was Indian, but I can see him there. And he used to be the mentor to Stella Rimington, who used to run MI5 or MI6, one or the other, I think it was MI5. And I was going through some, dark night of the soul with at something at Virgin Direct at that point, it was a while back. And I said to him, how on earth does Stella Rimington cope with the job that she's got, with all of the criticism that she has? And by the by, I think that about our politicians today, Theresa May, for example. And what he said to me was, don't take it personally. He said that Stella Rimington had said to him, look, I know that whoever sits in this chair will make similar decisions and get similar criticism, but it's about the role, it's not about me. Now, I think that's a really hard thing to do, and I'm not sure it's 100% accurate, of course, but I find it a very helpful thing to enable me to thicken my skin, if you know what I mean. If I feel I've done the right thing, made the right decision, heard the right voices, then in the end you realise that, well, do you know what, whoever's sitting here would probably take this flack, and this is not entirely about me, and I found that very helpful. You have to ask my team if I've increased my ability to bullshit. Yeah, probably.
That thing about separating out and saying, look, this is just my role, it's not something that's personally hitting me, has a danger, though, too, doesn't it? Because if you make it too much about the role and that you disappear from your engagement with that, then I guess you're then just criticised for being the leader who doesn't care.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense it comes back to what you talked about in terms of always needing to fight, because I think that's the balance, isn't it? That you should fight for what you believe in, but if you're criticised for it, you shouldn't internalise it too much, because that becomes too big a thing. I mean, by the way, I'm certainly not trying to be an apologist for Theresa May, but I do wake up every morning, thank God I'm not her. But whoever was doing that job, I think I might feel the same about, if you see what I mean. So I think it's quite important to do your job, do it to the best of your ability, bring yourself to it, but at the end realise that you have to be able to step away from it and know that that thing would have to be done by somebody else, and that criticism would probably be felt by other people too.
Sure. Just finally from me, and then we'll throw it open to questions as well, but looking back now, what advice would you give to yourself when you were at Royal Holloway, the sort of 20-year-old self? What would you be saying to yourself now?
Well, the reason I'm going to sound slightly more prepared on this than any other question, because we haven't discussed these questions, by the way, is that somebody else has asked me this recently. And I was quite interested that my answers were much more, sort of physical than anything else. So I would have realised that my health was more important than I treated it for a number of years. I would have run more because I love it and didn't get to it till quite late. And I would definitely have had more kids earlier.
We were talking earlier because we discovered we were both runners, but when I joined my running club, someone said to me, well, people who join a running club, they either run because they like running or they run because they want to eat more cake.
I'm both.
I'm only the latter.
But I'm definitely the latter, yeah.
Thank you very much. Perhaps if we can throw it open to questions. There are people with microphones here, so if you could put your hands up and then wait for the microphone to come to you, that would be great.
Can I see Amanda Mackenzie over there? Are you an alumni? Well, I never knew that.
Great. I think there's a hand over there. Thanks. And there's one right at the back up there, so we'll set the next one up.
Yes, good. Hi, I'm Vince Wood, I'm a student journalist. You mentioned that following your report, people had begun to sign up to the Charter, and that was one shift in the culture. I was wondering if you had noticed any other shifts in the culture since your work on the Women in Finance report.
In culture and financial services generally? I mean, I think the thought that comes to my mind straight away, and I hope there are more credible arguments than this too. Did you read about what happened at the President's Club, I don't know, 2 months ago or something? Now, I think it's quite interesting that the President's Club goings-on actually made the headlines, because I think that if the culture hadn't changed, they might not have actually even been commented on, if you see what I mean. So there's a sort of people took notice that this isn't really how we want business to operate in the current climate, in the current day and age, and I felt that was a good thing. You know, whatever you think about what happened at the President's Club, the fact that it was called out, I think, was a very good thing. The most surprising thing to me was that it was the front page of the Financial Times, and I think that in itself that made a really big statement. If it had been, forgive me, you know, if it had been in the Sun or the Mail, it might not have got as much coverage, but front page of the FT made it a really significant issue, and I think that said both, the culture has changed, and by the by, we're going to hold the city to making sure that the culture changes for better still, and I think that's really important.
I think there's one over there.
There's one down here as well.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, hello. Sorry, where are you? Oh, yeah, hello.
For your very inspiring lecture. Following on from the comments and the topic.
Sorry, can you just hold the microphone a bit nearer to yourself?
Yeah, just hold it near your mouth, I think.
Sorry, thank
That's
you
better.
very much for your very inspiring lecture. In the wake of recent events, things like the President's Club, one thing that I wanted to know was there have been moves in other organisations and cultures to change their culture, and for example in Formula One, I understand from the press it led to the cessation of, say, the jobs that are called pit girls, and this seemed to be without any consultation for the people involved. So do you think that it's going too far in a different direction? Perhaps we are championing a change in culture, but surely this shouldn't be without consultation of the people who are affected.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I find that a difficult one to answer. I was on the radio straight after the President's Club, and the first question was, do you think women should be allowed to be hostesses or not? And I hadn't actually thought that. I mean, of course, if they want to, I think that's absolutely fine. But I think that the point is that the President's Club was a situation where women were reporting that they felt that they were not being treated appropriately. And I think that there's a difference between doing a job that you want to do. I'm not being critical of the jobs that are there. I'm critical of inappropriate behaviour that's going to make women or men feel uncomfortable in any particular way. So I think one is a sort of a role-based point. We should all be able to make our choices around what role we want to play, and I don't think any of us have the right to be what's the word I'm looking at, sort of moralistic around what that role is. But if you don't want to do it, then I absolutely think there should be safeguards that mean that you don't feel uncomfortable because you happen to be a particular race, a particular sexuality, a particular gender in any situation, and I think that's what we're trying to call out here in terms of the sexual harassment point. I mean, the work that we've been doing in Women in Finance is, before all of that, didn't really focus on sexual harassment. It was much more around career progression. And it's quite clear that, the culture has to change to enable careers to progress equally, I think.
Thank you. And then down here was one.
Hi, Jayne-Anne. My name's Vivian. I graduated from Holloway 4 years ago. I'm working in financial services PR, actually with a few of your competitors.
Which one?
A couple, Skipton Building Society, HSBC,
Excellent.
A few others, I won't mention them.
Yeah. Well done.
And I've admired you from a distance for quite a long time. But I wanted to ask you about the gender pay gap in particular. Obviously, Virgin Money came out a little bit earlier than some of the other banks and building societies, and kind of rightly and wrongly were called out for the fact that your gender pay gap is quite high. And I wondered whether you think that whether there could ever be a 0% pay gap in financial services, and kind of what financial services brands and companies can do to kind of shift the culture, actual tangible things within the organisations. So,
the gender pay gap, and it's a really good question. The gender pay gap is an interesting thing because I think, just to make sure everybody's on the same page with it, it is looked at, it is calculated with two things in mind. First of all, it's reported as if it's the difference between what men and women are paid for the same job, which of course is not what the gender pay gap is. And I would say that, my own company, and in fairness nowadays, the vast majority of companies, if we put aside the BBC, do seem to pay men and women the same broadly for the same job. The real issue is all around the progression of women to senior posts. And so what we have in Virgin Money is we have many more women in customer services roles than men. I mean, it's 80% female. And we have, not at the board level, we're 50-50, and we've now just appointed a female chair. And in my exco, we're actually 60-40 men to women. But the level below that, we are about 70-30 men, women. And because the senior jobs are paid more highly, then obviously you get this skew because you've got the wrong balance of gender throughout the organisation, if you see what I mean. Now, to my earlier point about being about equality, not about what I've referred to as feminism, right or wrong, is I have no intention, and neither do others, of just going around and firing all the men, if you see what I mean, which would be the short-term answer to this problem, because you'd fill those jobs then with the top jobs with 50% women, and etc. What it means that we are focusing on, of course, is making sure that, although this might sound daft, we hadn't really realised that we were recruiting too many women in customer services roles, and so now we're as focused on making sure we bring men in to look after customer service as we are bringing women in at the top levels of the organisation. Now, when I talk about getting to 50-50 by 2020, that means 50% men, 50% women in every level of the organisation. To the extent we, Virgin Money or any other organisation, gets there, and you're paying men and women broadly the same, then broadly the gender pay gap will be zero. And so what you're really saying in the percentages that some companies are putting out is that you've just got too many men in senior jobs compared to women in more junior jobs. From my point of view, and I would say this, wouldn't I? I mean, my very strong argument is that we were the first company to publish our gender pay gap. And the reason for that is that, you know, we're big exponents of what gets measured gets done, where there's transparency you get change. And so I would say, despite all of the lurid headlines, and by the by, I wake up to them every morning. Obviously, I get my own press cuttings. Every morning I see, you know, Virgin Money's gender pay gap's terrible. I won't try and defend it. But my point is we should be calling out the companies that haven't disclosed it, because it's the ones that won't talk about it or the ones that manipulate it that are the real problem. The ones that are disclosing it are the ones that are trying to do something about it. And, you know, the professional service firms have been really bad. They have excluded their partners from their gender pay gap, and, you know, it makes it very different. And you have to applaud Ernst & Young, EY as they are now, because they actually, on International Women's Day, did come out and make sure that their partners were included in the gender pay gap. I'm aware of one very significant FTSE 100 company who has followed the letter of the law, which I can't remember exactly, but I think it says that if you don't have 250 people in your organisation, you don't have to report the pay gap. Now, this is a big FTSE 100 company. Their listed entity is their holding company, which has less than 250 people, and they're arguing they don't have to report it. Now, for me, that's outrageous, and those are the sort of organisations that properly need to get called out. So, of course, we should worry about the ones that report, and we should all be held to make sure that we get the right balance in the end. But what we shouldn't do is forget the ones that aren't reporting, because they probably are the bad ones. And, you know, calling these guys out is really important. One of the things that's really helped in the Women in Finance Charter is that Nicky Morgan took over as chair of the Treasury Select Committee 12 months-ish ago. She's taken the Women in Finance position very seriously, and I was called to give evidence in front of her, as were others recently, and she said, what can we do to make a difference? And I said, Chair, if you write to people and say, come and explain to me why you haven't signed the Women in Finance Charter, we'll probably get some extra signatures. We got 40 extra signatures. We went from 160 to 205 almost overnight, one of which was Goldman Sachs. Now, Goldman are our bankers, and I actually quite like them, but they wouldn't sign the blooming charter until Nicky Morgan asked them to explain why they wouldn't. And I think, you know, that's the change in culture, actually, that we have to have powerful men and media and politicians all saying this is an important agenda, and at that point we start to get real change. And, you know, we talk about the people that, I can't remember what, I forgot to say this, but you asked me a question, Casey, that made me think about it. I mean, I was really pleased on Friday when we reported the new numbers of the Charter, that the Prime Minister was quoted in it as saying this is an important thing. And, you know, if you've got that sort of support, then you must have impetus in making change, which is really important.
Thank you. I think there's one over here first, and then if the microphone wants to move down here.
This lady here.
Thank
Hello.
you very much for a fascinating talk, and your last answer I thought was particularly interesting. I've got a different type of question. You talked about your career and how your career developed and the importance of taking opportunities. And I agree with that very much so. But it's not so easy to recognise the opportunities and then decide to take them. I wondered, how important is the fact that you were at Royal Holloway and Bedford College and the attitudes within that college? Did you feel that that helped you in your career and your attitudes there?
I mean, I think I can't pinpoint, if I'm afraid, a sort of institutional answer to that. But what I would say in terms of my experiential point is that the people that I met there were so different to the life I'd been leading. That's what made me realise that you take your opportunities. In other words, the fact that, I mean, you know, this is all about the rich tapestry of life, but, you know, I met my husband, as I say, on the first day there. I remember that I was on Freshers, arrived on Freshers Day. He was playing snooker in one of the bars, which has probably been demolished along with Aslow now, which would be very sad.
I think the bar's still there.
Is the bar still there? We met on that particular day, and nearly 40 years later, we're still together. But it was a very difficult time because, you know, at that point, mixed relationships were quite unusual. He came from a very strict Hindu family. He was expected to have an arranged marriage. And I think that those sort of experiences, for me at least, because I'd had quite a sheltered childhood. I was 17 or 18. I mean, I must have been 18. I came to a holiday literally on my 18th birthday. And, you know, they were life-changing. And I think the college was very supportive in helping me through that. And I think that, you know, that both gave me the fight, if you like, for both me and my husband. It'd been dead easy to just pack it all in and go, this is all far too difficult for everybody involved, and we decided to fight on. But as I said in an earlier answer, I think we all need support when we get to difficult times, and I found it in Royal Holloway College.
There's a question down here, and then we'll have one last one, I think, after that. Perhaps if you want to go towards the sort of centre back there.
Hello.
I'm also an alumni from Royal Holloway, and I've also spent most of my career in financial services, so I've just found this evening very, very interesting. Just going back to the gender pay gap question, just to broaden it out a bit, actually, because financial services is, after all, an area in which we can still say that the UK is a world leader. So perhaps it's very important. Because I know The Economist runs an index every year of where we are internationally on gender pay gap. And I would have thought we would have been in the top 10, but we're like, UK is 15. And I'm wondering if perhaps leadership from within financial services may help in that position. Do you see anything differently globally? Perhaps, as I said, opening it out.
Yeah. So, I mean, really good question. And I think one of the things I should say is that I don't think that George Osborne, just out of the kindness of his heart, decided that equality was a good thing. You know, to Katie's earlier point, it's absolutely proven that diversity generates better returns, and in particular, which is really important, of course, for our country, it drives productivity. And given that we've fallen back so far in terms of productivity relative, certainly to the other EU27, really, you know, addressing the gender pay gap and addressing women in business is something that will really help productivity. Now, to your point around what does that look like around the rest of the world, the really interesting thing for me is not very long ago, perhaps about 3 weeks ago, I saw a table that shows that where the gender pay gap is narrowest, productivity is highest. And I think that, you know, thank you for reminding me of that, because I remember I was saying at the time, we must try and get that out, because it starts to, for people that think that this is some sort of, you know, middle-aged or older than that woman's crusade, it's not just the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do.
Exactly, it's not just about being nice.
Definitely. No, it's about being right. You know, why would you treat 50% of the potential workforce that are going to be creative, innovative and productive in a different way than the other 50%? Ridiculous. Let's get on with treating everybody the same and driving productivity that way. And I will now make sure that I try and get that out into the... You somebody over there, you said you're a journalist. That's the story. Don't forget productivity and gender pay gap.
Thanks. I think we had something towards the back. Thank you. Probably better to make this the last one. Thank you very much.
Hi there. Yes, it was a very interesting lecture. My name is Valentina Christensen. I'm the Communications Director for Oak North Bank.
For where, sorry?
For Oak North Bank.
Yep,
It's another challenger bank. And my question is really around mentors. A lot of women and men I hear from this sort of talk about the mentors in their career. I'm interested, given that you went into something where you joined a marketing team, whether you sort of got some help there, the mentors that have helped you along your career so far, and whether you mentor people and what that relationship looks like.
Yes, I mean, it's a really interesting question. So I live in Edinburgh, and Nicola Sturgeon wrote to a number of people in the business community recently. I'm really hoping that this isn't confidential. and basically suggested, I think it was on International Women's Day, and I think she wrote to a number of senior business women to say, why don't we each mentor a woman in Scotland, because that will help to to share experiences around the country. And I thought that was a really fascinating thing for her to do. So I agree that mentorship's important. I think lots of people agree that mentorship's important. If I'm honest, I've always found it difficult. I mean, now that I'm older, I find this sort of thing easier. Because I'm sat here talking about myself, you might think I find this easy. For most of my life, I haven't done. I'm just old enough now to be able to be more comfortable in my skin to do it. And I've never quite felt that I didn't really know what I'd offer anybody as a mentor, and normally I haven't got enough time, and I'm rushing around and all sorts of stuff. So, and for me, I did have a mentor on one occasion. I think I must have been at Norwich, and it didn't really work because it was a bit awkward, In fact, I had one at RBS as well. He was in Ireland. It was a huge effort. I had to fly to Dublin to go and see him. His name was Cormac. And, we'd sit in a room and he'd say, how can I help? And actually, I didn't know the right question. He didn't really know the right answer. It was all a bit awkward. The real mentors, I think, in my life are the people that just drop in that helpful word from time to time, and you go back and reflect on it afterwards and think, you know what? That was a really important thing to say to me at this particular time. So, at least, I mean, there's lots and lots and lots, but the two that immediately come to my mind is when I talked about leaving. I was at Norwich Union and I was the accountant, and the business wasn't doing what it should, and my boss sent me to marketing. And I was really upset about it because I, built this little tiny accountancy team, but it felt like mine. And I remember being upset and saying to him, but Barry, I don't really want to go because this is mine. And he looked at me and he said, but Jayne-Anne, isn't all of Norwich Union yours? And it was such a brilliant moment. And I thought, gosh, you know what? Yeah, perhaps it could be. And he sort of opened up my horizons in a way that a mentor across the table would never do, if you know what I mean. And then, secondly, in much more up to date, our chairman, Glenn Marino, is just about to retire. He's 75. He's American. Goes back to America on the 1st of April. Wanted to go back before the 5th of April. Can't remember why. And he has been the best chairman I've ever had. And it's really interesting. I mean, I slightly cringe, right, both because of it, because he's overly complimentary in this expression, and also quite critical. And he said to me now over many years, people have asked me how I've got on working with you, Jayne-Anne, and I say to them that I feel as if I'm at Covent Garden. I have a diva, and my job is to make sure she can sing. And I think that's real mentorship. And what he's done, I talked earlier about how it's so easy for all of us to put other people down. Through the nearly 4 years that I've worked with him, he has been the one person who has only ever been supportive. And that's not to say he hasn't challenged. I've always, chatted to him. He's always gone, you're absolutely right, but have you thought about it this way? And I've tried very hard. Some of the people that work with me are here now. I don't know if I pull that off, but I try quite hard to do that myself, because it's so empowering of an individual. And if you empower a CEO, you empower an organisation, actually, I've realised. And so I think that mentorship can be unstructured and more effective, but I think it's important.
Thank you very much. I think I should just take you up on that note and say...
There's
Jayne-Anne.
one man there. Oh, you're just about to finish, aren't we?
I will. I think
Are we finished? Oh, we'll go on.
Well, do you want to answer
Have a drink
quickly?
after.
Oh, all right, have a drink after. I was just going to...
no, he's going for it.
Go on then.
Go on,
Just a
he's
quick
going for
answer to it.
Sorry, this is the last one, yeah?
Thank you. My name's Tom Dennis. I run an organisation which brings men and women together to engage in dialogue. I'm just following up on that question about mentorship because I was very interested to see that Sheryl Sandberg a couple of weeks ago was saying that they really needed to change mentorship, certainly in the States, because men were now withdrawing from mentoring women. Just as I talked to somebody who was in New York the other day, and he came back and he said, I got in the lift, but there was just a woman, and then I got out again. So that is the States, but we do tend to copy what goes on in the States. So I'm curious as to how you feel things are going and what needs to be done to ease that tension.
As I say, I think it's really interesting. So one of the things that's been great for me as a person, I think, I'm very fortunate just to be like this, right, is that I'm quite old now, but I've never stopped learning, and I love that. And I've met some people recently, very senior people, and I can't tell you who they are because I would be letting them down. But I was about to present my year-end results this February, and this particular person said to me, a bit like mentorship, if you like, went through a few things, and he said to me, the one thing that I'd say to you is be confident. You've got a great story to tell, be confident. Now, you might think I don't need to be told to be confident, right? But I do, and we all do. And for me, that was not so much just about my personal demeanour, but about the actual story that we told. And then, funny enough, only a few days ago, I was somewhere with another group of very influential people, and somebody else around the table said, how can we help to make things good in the country? And the answer was, be positive and be confident, right? And I thought, that's really interesting that tone is important. And that's partly why I always address this sort of subject by saying, this is about men and women, all of whom are purposeful, passionate, and want to do the right thing. Nobody's better than anybody else, everybody's great. We shouldn't be in a place where anybody's frightened of being with anybody else. And I think that we all have to make that happen. You know, I think that the culture that we live in, the society that we live in, is down to us. And I don't know if any of you saw, I mean, some of you might think it's stupid, but I quite enjoyed seeing The Shape of Water. I wouldn't have seen it if it hadn't won the Oscars, but I enjoyed seeing The Shape of Water. I like to interpret it as a film about diversity and its breadth of purpose, but anyway, we'll see if it's that or not. But the one line that struck me on it, and maybe it's a line that comes from somewhere else, because I found it quite powerful, and I mentioned it to my daughter afterwards, and she'd noticed too. And that line was, if you do nothing, you are nothing. And for me, we are all something, and we have to do something. And to answer your question, we need to do something.
Just thank you so much. I will take your own cue from you to say thank you for singing for us tonight.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll agree it's been an enjoyable and thought-provoking evening. I'd like to thank you, Jayne-Anne, for finding a time in a really busy schedule to be here tonight. We all really appreciate that. Regardless of who we are and where we are in our lives, I hope that listening to Jayne-Anne has inspired you to be rather than seen and to pursue your goals that you have set yourself. So with that, I hope you'll now join us all in the Macmillan Hall, which is directly opposite as you go out for a reception. But before we do that, please once again join with me in showing our appreciation for our guest speaker, Jayne-Anne Gadhia. Thank you.